Hello, and welcome back to Redaction Report. I appreciate we've been away. We didn't have a show last month. That's because for various reasons, I was tied down. Our other guests have been away, but now we're back. And, well, we're more or less picking up where we left off. We're talking about France again. I'm joined by Tom Judge once again. And we're talking about elections once again. But this time we are talking about the legislative election. Yes, I pronounced that right. We were just talking about that before we came on air. Legislative election in France. This follows a couple of months later after the presidential election, in which Emmanuel Macron was resoundingly re-elected. I had to get one word wrong, didn't I? Link below for our discussion on that. But now we are going to talk about the follow-up elections, which yielded a slightly less triumphant result for Mr. Macron. His party, now rebranded Renaissance, formerly La République En Marche, has lost its overall majority quite substantially. It's now down to around 245 seats. The left-wing grouping, NUPES, under Jean-Luc Mélenchon, which combined his own party, along with the Old Socialist Party, along with the Greens, and others clocked in around 131 seats. Biggest gain of the day, though, was for Marine Le Pen's party, Le Rassemblement National. I butchered that pronunciation horribly, but the National Rally, which gained 89 seats, all the way up from 8 seats. I'll repeat that, 8 seats in 2017 to 89 seats now. That's a far-right party. And the mainstream centre-right party, the Republicans, dropped from 130 to 64 seats. Tom, what's next?
Oh, what's next indeed? As you know, with most European legislative, oh my God, I was the one that got the word wrong. Legislative elections. We're now into the point where people will talk. I think formal negotiations only started yesterday. I believe. So now we'll see what comes next. Obviously, Macron's party under the Prime Minister Elizabeth Borne will still rule in minority, but it will yet to be seen where the support. What do they need? An extra 30 odd seats. To actually, form majorities to get legislation through, will come from. It was considered that the centre right would maybe form a coalition in the aftermath, but that has been ruled out now. So it's yet to be seen what will come next. I think Macron is maybe currently, and has been over the last day or so, meeting with all the leaders in the parliament. So it's yet to be seen. But this is obviously a big blow to his agenda, which I think in the end just proved very unpopular. I think the most unpopular part probably being pension age, has really seen what he'll be able to do for the next 5 years, because it's very unprecedented in French politics. There hasn't been a hung parliament for quite some time. I think the last hung parliament was in '97. And the last time no alliance won was in '88. So this is fresh-ish ground for French politics, and it just goes to show the volatility. Obviously, all of the top 3 parties, the top 3 alliances, were non-existent in French politics just a few years ago, and now they are the top 3.
Worth remembering, of course, that Macron's party was brand new going into 2017 and won a majority, just to prove security and volatility. We're great on words today, aren't we? Volatility in politics. But let's talk for a second about Elizabeth Borne. We'll come back to the agenda in just a second. But Elizabeth Borne was just appointed Prime Minister of France by Macron last month in the lead up to the elections. Often happens that a new prime minister might be appointed just ahead of legislative elections. She's offered her resignation to Macron after pressure. He refused it, at least for the meantime, while government talks are ongoing, shall we say. We're looking at a potentially interesting situation here. Obviously, leader of that left-wing bloc, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is a controversial figure to say the least, seen as someone on the hard left, has bigged himself up as a potential prime minister, and had been talked that he might be a potential candidate. Who might we be looking at?
Well, Mélenchon isn't actually in the parliament. He didn't restand.
No, he's not. He did not. He stood down from his seat.
And the thing about, I mean, Nupes was very successful, but now that they are sitting in the parliament, I think a lot of the leaders of I think it's 5 parties that were part of the alliance, have said that they won't sit as a group. They will all sit separately. Mélenchon's bloc is the biggest within the alliance, but it could become the case that more of the centre parties could maybe make up those seats that they need. I think the socialists, who were down by a couple of seats, they were already in the 20s. I think they were down by about 5 seats as well. So I think they're on some 20 something, and the Green Party could potentially make up that difference, but that seems you'd be still on a very thin majority if that is the case.
Yeah, I mean, friends I have who I speak to on both the left and the right will say the Socialist Party is a has-been at this point. The main left of centre force in French politics now is going to be La France and Insoumise, Mélenchon.
Yeah, but at the time of recording, Mélenchon is the only leader that Macron has not met. He's met Le Pen, but he's not met Mélenchon. So it does seem very unlikely that Macron's party will work with them, even though they have a sizable bloc in the parliament. It seems very unlikely that he'll work with him.
It's worth considering the French voting system at this point, that they work with 2 rounds, and that you'll go to a runoff in your constituency if you don't meet a certain voting threshold, with the top 2 candidates going forward.
Yeah.
Now, we had a lot of centre to centre left to even centre right commentators in the second round of the presidential election, calling on the left to support Macron on the grounds of lesser of 2 evils, which, to be fair, I completely agree with. You know, when a fascist like Le Pen is on the ballot paper, there's no time for messing around. At the same time, it's very clear that these people weren't prepared to return the favour when it came to centre-left candidates up against right-wing candidates in the legislative election. So many of Macron's party who got knocked out in the first round refused to endorse in the second.
Yeah, so I think there is data to back this up as well. I don't know how many seats this might have cost Nupes, where they could have won against National Rally, but there is data to suggest that something like 70 to 80% of Macron supporters, centrists, when faced with voting for Mélenchon or Le Pen's party, just stayed at home. Whereas, the data did suggest that when in the second round of the presidential election, Mélenchon's bloc, most of them did vote. In the end, there was some hesitance about it, and some people thought maybe they would either stay home en masse or potentially even vote for Le Pen. They did actually back Macron. And even within, we saw within the commentariat a lot of people saying they have to vote for Macron. It's their duty to vote for Macron. We did not see that same sentiment rehashed at all, really, as far as I can see this time round.
It's in part that a lot of them were looking for anyone to blame but themselves if they lost. They were setting up the left as a scapegoat for if they lost. At the same time, they're half right in saying that the left and the centre need to work together in the face of the far right, because there are too many people on both the left and the centre who see each other. This doesn't just apply to France, of course, who see each other as the main problem, when the biggest threat to liberal democracy right now is the resurgent far right. And, if on a short-term basis, the liberals and leftists can't learn to put aside their differences temporarily and work against the far right, we have not learned the lessons of the 1930s. I believe this is a point I made in the previous podcast too, but it can't be made.
It's not even the lessons of the 1930s anymore, is it? It's the lessons of the last few years.
Well, yes, that too.
we've had a fascist president in the US, and we've come very close to some, well, if you want to call him a fascist, that's a whole different debate. But we've had a far right president in the US, and we've come very close, and we've seen luckily, because most of Europe has proportional representation systems, it's not wound up quite so extreme. In the end, a lot of these democratic systems withstood the shock of a rise of the far right. I think France, you could probably argue France has gotten closest because it's got the least proportional system.
You could argue that Italy came closer. Well,
yeah, that's true.
Matteo Salvini was literally deputy prime minister of Italy at one point. So
yeah, we'll see. The next election in Italy will be
terrifying.
A big test for that.
That's a podcast for next year.
Yes. But yes, this is often a problem. But I do feel like it's that leftists will hold their nose and vote for somebody who they don't necessarily agree with on maybe even a majority of their politics, but will still hold their nose. Whereas I don't think that centrists and liberals, from my perspective anyway, do the same courtesy.
I think that's very fair to say. Speaking of the politics, though, let's go back to Macron's agenda then. Because Macron was elected in 2017, presenting himself as a big tent candidate, trying to appeal to people across the aisle. But since he's been president, I think a lot of people have quite fairly characterized him as being on the center right, even though he's tried to present himself as a centrist. We saw the Gilets jaunes protest against the massively regressive fuel tax policy that was proposed. And now we've seen talk of him raising the pension age as part of one of his main policies going into this election. This may sound like a loaded question, and it clearly is, but is there any surprise there's been a backlash?
No, not at all. I mean, even just looking at the bloc, because Renaissance was not standing on its own, it was part of an alliance as well. Even just looking at that alliance, most of the other members of it are centrist to centre right. I think there's only one party in it that you could possibly say is centre left. So the movement across to the centre right isn't shocking. I mean, he was a minister under a socialist government at one point. So
it's a very centrist socialist government.
Yes, but so it's a long journey to have been on. But it's not that shocking at all, and I think it probably it has led to the hollowing out of the traditional centre-right party to a massive extent, down even further in this election. Still not to the extent that the socialists were, but still down nonetheless. And now it seems like with this election that it can only go further, because how can he governed for 5 years with a majority and with a pretty substantial mandate in 2017. Like, he won quite well in both at both the presidential level and the parliamentary level, and then just seemed to not really deliver that much. The centre ground doesn't seem to be ripe with ideas to get anything done. So it's hardly a shock that when faced with that at the ballot, people are either staying away because first round voting, I think, was the lowest it's ever been in the modern and contemporary setting, or going to the extremes. It's not surprising at all, really, what's happened.
Absolutely. And it goes to prove one of the big problems of running a big tent campaign, because when people describe themselves as centrists, they usually mean one of two things. They either mean they're trying to think big tent and be a certain thing to everyone, or they're very hardline committed to the status quo, or a bit of both. And what Macron was clearly trying to go for in the first place was the former of those two things. He wasn't presenting himself as a status quo candidate. He was trying to present himself as a sort of big tent reformer, sort of modernizer, that sort of thing. The problem with running a big tent campaign is once you actually come to govern, you've got to pick a direction of travel. And when you do so, you're inevitably going to leave people disappointed. And we see that. We've seen the massive drop in turnout here, but this is by no means exceptional to centrist candidates. You know, US presidential election turnout hit less than 50% in Bill Clinton's re-election. Under Tony Blair, people always forget, Tony Blair was elected with massive majorities. The part that often gets left out is elected on massive majorities on a massive collapse in turnout. So there are a few ideological groupings who more overestimate the extent of their appeal than centrists.
Yeah,
and
looking at where those examples went afterwards as well, is that you went to George Bush, fairly right-wing president, and then we have, now 12 years of Conservative government, 5 of them with the Lib Dems, under a fairly right-wing program, even from the beginning.
And 6 of them post-Brexit, milking that culture war for all it's worth.
Yeah. Now with a very, very large majority. Obviously, it took them a while to get there. But throughout the entire 21st century, in every election that's ever happened in the UK, the Conservative vote share has gone up. The Conservatives haven't seen a decline in their vote share since 1997.
Do you know which general election the Conservatives increased their vote share by the most in one election?
2017.
It was 2017. That's a can of worms we won't open today, though.
But that's I mean, God, we're a long way off, obviously, from the next set of elections, considering they just happened. But that could be the future if the recent precedents in comparable economies are anything to go by. Then centrist candidates will eventually just lead to an increased presence of the right and the far right. The Republican presidents that have come in the US have by no means been consolidators, people on the centre who are looking to reach across the aisle. And the same can probably be said in the UK as well.
If there's any sense of hope to be had there, is that those centrist collapses in the UK and the US happened under the main centre-left party, whereas it hasn't happened in France. And that's the one thing to be said. One of the reasons why left-wing populism hasn't taken off in the same way right-wing populism hasn't, from where I'm sitting, is that the right at the moment seems to be better at crafting narratives. And that's what any good politician, any good leader is, a good storyteller. And the right have been better at crafting a narrative than the left have. Because let's face it, too much and too often the left, and I think both Corbyn and to a lesser extent Sanders were very guilty of this, is leaning too much into nostalgia rather than into a forward-thinking vision. And unless the left can come up with new ideas and can come up with a new narrative, they're doomed to just repeat those mistakes again.
Yeah. What New Pez, if they still remain New Pez at the next election, does, because obviously they are the second biggest alliance if you put them all together, although of course they won't sit as an alliance, but they are the second biggest in Parliament, in the French Parliament. So what they do after this, and how they try and shape the narrative, if they do try and extract wins, if they do try and work with Macron's government, what they are and what they choose to try and extract from this government will be very important. There is a narrative to be shaped. The cost of living crisis is a global thing. How will they just lean into austerity like we have seen centre-left parties do before, which is just, it's not going to cut it? Or will they actually go after the things that people want? That's what the next 5 years have got to be for the French left. If they want a chance, obviously, because it's an open race in 2027. So that's what they've got to do. They've got to find that narrative and have it and build it over the next 5 years. And I think they are in quite a strong position to do that. They have a lot of new talent in the Parliament. They have a diversity of voices. I think this alliance has proven to be very good for them. So we'll see. There's a lot of time to go before then, but we'll see how they're able to do that over the next 5 years.
Tom, thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Welcome back. And now I'm joined once again by Richard Hewison, leader of the Rejoin EU Party. And we are going to be talking about Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, of course, has been one of the biggest talking points throughout the Brexit process. Arguably, one of the main things that sunk Theresa May's deal, among other things, back in 2019. Still remains one of the biggest talking points, especially in the wake of the recent local elections in the UK. Now, Sinn Féin has for the first time become the largest party in Northern Ireland, overtaking the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, largely seen as a hard right party, very pro-UK. Richard, from the point of view of an anti-Brexit campaigner, what did you make of the result?
Well, I think obviously quite a lot of the tension was over the protocol and the existence and the continuance of the protocol. And I think it's just worth reminding ourselves of what we called back in 2016 the Brexit paradox. You have to have a border between Britain and France for Brexit to work, but you can't have a border between France and Ireland. You can't have a border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, and you can't have a border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And this very, very unhappy compromise of basically drawing an iron curtain down the Irish Sea and separating at that point in terms of goods that the protocol offered, obviously was going to upset the unionist community very, very badly. But it has actually, well, I say it's delivered stability. Obviously, the number of grace periods we've had with extending deadlines on checking cold meats into Northern Ireland, now pretty much extended indefinitely, basically means that it seems to be working well for everyone apart from the unionist community. And I totally understand that. And let me just say, I have a huge amount of sympathy for everybody in Northern Ireland, whichever community they're in, because very, very little consultation has happened to the people of Northern Ireland as to the status of Northern Ireland within the Union and within the European Union. And that I do feel has been neglected. Now, I think voters were very, very aware of the protocol and the potential for the protocol being changed. And I think they very much voted with their feet. If we now have a look at the new Northern Ireland Assembly, 57 out of the 90 members are pro keeping the protocol in place as it stands at the moment.
Now, of course, the Democratic Unionist Party, which opposes the protocol, very strongly pro-UK party, has said it will not nominate a deputy leader, a deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland until Boris Johnson, quote unquote, addresses issues around the protocol. Now, for some context, under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, which ended the decades-long conflict between unionist nationalists in Ireland, both unionist and nationalist communities must agree to power share. The largest in the Northern Ireland Assembly must put up the First Minister, and the second largest must put up the Deputy First Minister. Now, as Sinn Féin, a nationalist party, is the largest party, it's, for the first time ever, is entitled to nominate a First Minister, and it would be beholden on the DUP to nominate a deputy, but they must both agree before that power sharing can happen. Boris Johnson's been in Northern Ireland to attempt to restore the power sharing. What have you made of his attempts?
Well, I think, first of all, the Democratic Unionist Party have really acted against their first word there, because what they're doing is not democratic. We have a new assembly. The new assembly is not even not nominating a minister. Don't forget, they've also blocked the election of a speaker to the assembly, meaning that we can't even have assembly meetings where issues can be put to votes of the floor to determine the direction we were going. And it's not surprising, because of course it is something that the DUP would lose in the Northern Ireland Assembly, almost certainly, if they were trying to get a vote for ditching the protocol. So this sort of blackmail technique is totally scurrilous. And whichever party was doing this under whatever circumstance, I hope Democrats would frown on such movements. But unfortunately, they do seem to now have the UK government pretty much by the short and curlies. And let's be honest, Boris Johnson's trip to Northern Ireland is very, very unlikely to calm things down and settle things. Although I do hear a couple of press reports that the DUP might be feeling more moderate now, which we'll wait and see if that actually plays out.
Well, it's worth remembering that Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, the current leader of the DUP, was meant to be seen as one of the more moderate members of the DUP. Last year, there was, of course, a leadership election, which a gentleman called Edwin Poots won to start with, who, for people who don't know, is quite a character. He's a young earth creationist. Gives you an insight into the DUP right there, that this man was elected their leader. He is now no longer leader, and Geoffrey Donaldson is, but of course he's been saying until the terms of the protocol are changed, he will not be putting either himself or anyone else forward to be Deputy First Minister. What's next then?
That's a very good question. I have to say, obviously Liz Truss's statement to the Commons yesterday was a little bit worrying in its context. The idea of doing something with Article 16 and trying to override the protocol by technically pretending you're introducing something that's to help the protocol when in actual fact it's not, would of course be a very, very dangerous precedent to set. It would breach international law potentially, and the EU have already indicated that we can expect a robust legal response if that actually happens.
Well, time's going to tell as to what is going to play out with Northern Ireland. Eternally unpredictable. It's predictable in its unpredictability, you might almost say. So what's next for the Rejoin EU Party then?
Very good question. At the moment, we are looking at our recent council election results. We had a trial area in Barnet Council to see how our message would go. We were very encouraged by that as well. Also, obviously, we're very interested to see how some of the other parties are moving. Certainly the Liberal Democrats have upped their game a fair amount, still not exactly where we'd want them to be, but certainly moving in the right direction when it comes to rejoining the EU, and certainly clearly putting it in terms of its policy documents.
One thing that strikes me at the moment is that the anti-Brexit campaign seems to have lost a lot of momentum. Do you feel that, you know, the wind's out of the sails of the Rejoin movement at the moment, and what do you think could be done to change that?
I think we're in a very interesting position, Jason, because whenever we see polling evidence at the moment, it seems quite clear that a modest but firm majority of the UK think Brexit was a mistake, would like to see various aspects of Brexit reversed, and would like to consider potentially rejoining the EU. I mean, the interesting polling evidence is when you say, was Brexit a mistake, quite a strong majority. Should Brexit be reversed? Slightly less strong majority. Should we rejoin the EU? Slightly less strong majority, but still a majority. So we're in a situation where, to a large extent, I feel the argument has been won, but there's just no democratic mechanism to put the will of the people, for want of a better term, into action at this stage. And while we have this current government that just rides roughshod over any public opinion in any particular area, they certainly don't care about the opposition. They don't even care about their own manifesto. I don't think there's going to be much progress. So I think to a large extent, it's not that the wind is out of people's sails. It's just that people realize all they can do at the moment is plan for how to act with better administration.
Richard, thanks very much for joining us.
Pleasure. Lovely to see you as ever, James. Take care.
Thank you.